The night hung heavy over Redwood Bluff. The humid air carried the scent of rain, and the streets were empty, lit only by flickering streetlights and the neon signs of run-down bars. Inside a parked patrol car in a dark alley, Declan Holloway gripped the steering wheel, his eyes locked on his phone screen. The message glowed like a warning sign in his mind. The target leaves the courthouse in 5 minutes. Make sure she understands who runs this town. Deck scoffed, tossing the phone onto the dashboard. Beside him, his partner Silas Reddick fiddled with the police radio, avoiding eye contact. "This still feels like a bad idea, Deck," Silas muttered. "It's not an ambush, it's a warning," Deck shot back, adjusting the badge on his chest. "This woman comes in from out of town, thinks she can stick her nose in our business and change everything. She needs to know Redwood Bluff has rules." Silas sighed but didn't argue. They both knew her arrival had rattled the department. An outsider. And worse, someone who actually cared about rules and accountability. Deck pushed open the car door, stepping out onto the damp pavement. His pulse quickened as he spotted the woman emerging from the courthouse doors. Navy blue suit, steady stride, unreadable expression. There she was. Nyah Calloway. Deck clenched his jaw. So confident. So untouchable. He tightened his grip on his flashlight as he stepped forward, adrenaline surging through him. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice carried authority as he blocked her path. Nyah stopped, her dark eyes scanning the situation. A dimly lit alley, a white officer standing in her way, another watching from the patrol car. She read it instantly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was calm, steady. Deck smirked. "That depends. The courthouse is full of people who don't understand how things work around here. If I were you, I'd be careful. Redwood Bluff isn't easy for outsiders." Nyah tilted her head slightly, as if savoring every word. "Are you threatening me, Officer Holloway?" Deck's stomach twisted. How does she know my name? Before he could respond, footsteps echoed behind him. A group of officers exited the courthouse, and among them, the interim sheriff walked briskly, holding an envelope. "Officer Declan Holloway," the sheriff announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are standing in front of Redwood Bluff's new chief of police." Deck felt his blood run cold. Nyah Calloway was his boss. She just smiled. For a moment, the world around Declan Holloway seemed to freeze. The chatter of officers, the distant hum of traffic, even the damp night air pressing against his skin, everything faded into a low, droning noise. His heartbeat, however, pounded loud and fast in his ears. He had spent the past 15 years in the Redwood Bluff Police Department, working his way up, proving his worth, believing he knew exactly how this town worked. Now, in the span of 30 seconds, he had unknowingly tried to intimidate his own boss. And worse, she was standing there, watching him like a predator who had just caught her prey making a fatal mistake. Nyah didn't move at first. She let the moment sink in, her gaze never leaving Deck's face. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just a steady, unreadable expression that made it impossible to tell what she was thinking. That made it worse. A smirk or some sarcastic remark would have at least given Deck something to push back against. Instead, she simply studied him, as if already calculating what to do with him. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then, with deliberate ease, she stepped forward, closing the space between them just enough to make it clear. She was in control now. "Something wrong, Officer Holloway?" Her voice was smooth, almost casual, but with an unmistakable edge. She was challenging him, daring him to respond. Deck swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to snap back. He could feel the eyes of the other officers on them, waiting to see how he'd react. His reputation wasn't just built on his years in the force, it was built on being the guy who never backed down, the one who called the shots, even when he wasn't officially in charge. But now, with Nyah Calloway standing in front of him, power shifting like a slow-moving earthquake beneath his feet, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Cornered. Dec forced a neutral expression, though his jaw was tight. "Not at all, Chief," he said, the title tasting bitter in his mouth. He watched as her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to let him know she caught the hesitation. Nyah gave a small nod, then turned her attention to the gathered officers. "I expect to see everyone at headquarters first thing in the morning. We have work to do." Her voice carried easily over the courtyard, commanding, firm. Not asking. Stating. Without waiting for a response, she walked past Dec, her heels clicking against the pavement as she disappeared into a waiting black sedan. Only then did the tension snap back into motion, conversations resuming in hushed tones, officers exchanging cautious glances. Silas finally let out a long breath. "Well, shit." His voice was low, almost amused. "That could have gone worse." Dec shot him a glare, his mind racing. "She's going to tear this department apart," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. He wanted to believe Nyah was just another bureaucrat, a temporary disruption that would pass like the others before her. But something about the way she handled herself, the way she looked at him, like she already had him figured out, made him uneasy. This wasn't just about a new boss. This was about control. And Declan Holloway wasn't about to give his up. The next morning, at headquarters, he would make sure Nyah Calloway knew exactly where she stood. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Redwood Bluff Police Headquarters, casting long shadows across the squad room. Officers moved between desks, some pretending to be busy, others openly murmuring about last night's revelation. The tension in the air was thick, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface. Everyone knew a shift in power was happening, but no one, not even Declan Holloway, knew exactly what it would look like. Dec stood near the coffee machine, gripping a steaming cup, though he wasn't drinking. His eyes stayed locked on the glass-walled office at the far end of the room, where Nyah Calloway sat behind her new desk. No pictures, no personal items, just stacks of files and a laptop. A blank slate, but one with dangerous potential. From the moment she stepped into the building, she carried herself like she'd been there for years, like she wasn't just another outsider passing through. That alone made Dec's gut tighten. He had seen chiefs come and go, but none had walked in like they already owned the place. The low murmur of voices cut short as Nyah pushed open her office door and stepped out. Her gaze swept the room, steady and unreadable, before finally landing on Dec. "Officer Holloway. My office. Now." The words were simple, but there was no mistaking the authority in them. She didn't request. She commanded. A few officers glanced between them, waiting for Dec to resist, but he didn't. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee before setting it down and making his way across the room. If Nyah was trying to establish dominance, he wasn't about to make it easy for her. Inside her office, the air felt different. Quieter. More controlled. Nyah closed the door behind him, then leaned against the desk, arms crossed. Dec didn't sit. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. "I'm going to make one thing clear," Nyah said, her tone even but sharp as glass. "I know exactly who you are, Officer Holloway. I know how things have been run in this department. That ends today." Dec's fingers curled at his sides, but he kept his face neutral. "With all due respect, Chief, Redwood Bluff isn't some big city department. Things work differently here." "No," Nyah corrected, taking a step closer. "They've worked your way. Now they'll work mine." The silence between them was razor-thin, and for the first time in a long time, Dec felt something unfamiliar coiling in his chest. Not just anger. Not just resentment. Something closer to fear. Dec didn't break eye contact. Nyah Calloway might have had the badge, but authority wasn't just given, It was earned, controlled, and in some cases, taken. He had spent years shaping this department into what it was, and he wasn't about to let some outsider walk in and rip it apart. But Nyah wasn't backing down either. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, like she wasn't just expecting a fight, she was prepared for it. The silence was thick, neither of them blinking, until Nyah finally exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "You think this is a game," she said, her voice calm but laced with quiet steel. "You think if you push hard enough, I'll fold. That I'll pack up and leave, like the others before me. Let me save you some time, Officer Holloway. I don't scare easily." She stepped around him, moving toward the window, watching the officers outside. "And I don't play by the rules you've written for this place." Dec smirked, though there was no humor in it. "That's the problem with outsiders. You think you know how to fix things, but you don't even understand what's broken." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "This town doesn't trust people like you. People who show up and try to rewrite the way things work. It spits them out." He saw the flicker in her eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, but recognition. Like she had heard this speech before. Like she had expected it. Nyah turned back to him, stepping so close that for a brief second, Dec wasn't sure who was cornering who. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I don't understand everything about this town. But I understand men like you." She let the words settle, then added, "And men like you always make the same mistake. You underestimate the wrong person." Before Dec could respond, a knock sounded at the door, and Silas Reddick poked his head in, looking between them. "Chief Holloway, we've got a situation." His voice was clipped, professional, but the look in his eyes was tense. Something had happened. Nyah glanced at Dec, the moment between them breaking. "We'll finish this conversation later." Her voice was a promise, not a threat. And for the first time, as Dec followed her out the door, he felt an unfamiliar sensation crawling under his skin. Uncertainty. The squad room was buzzing with tension as Nyah and Dec stepped out of her office. Officers were gathered around a police radio, their faces tight with unease. Silas Reddick stood at the center, arms crossed, waiting for them. "We've got a hostage situation, corner of Pine and Fairview," he announced. "Local convenience store. 2 suspects, both armed. Clerks trapped inside." His gaze flicked between Nyah and Dec, as if unsure which of them would take charge. Without missing a beat, Nyah grabbed a radio from a nearby desk. "Who's on the scene?" Her voice was sharp, all business, as if their earlier confrontation had never happened. A response crackled through the radio. Patrol officers had arrived, but the suspects were unstable, screaming at anyone who got too close. They were threatening to start shooting. Time was running out. Dec exhaled, already moving toward the exit. "Let's go." He didn't need permission. This was his city, his turf, and situations like this were his specialty. He had handled dozens of standoffs before, talked men down, taken the right shots when necessary. He didn't need a new boss stepping in and screwing it up. But Nyah didn't hesitate. She was right behind him. As they climbed into separate vehicles and sped toward the scene, Dec gripped the wheel, his mind racing. Would she step aside and let him handle it? Or would she make a move just to prove a point? Either way, this was about more than just a hostage. It was about who truly had control over this department. When they arrived, the flashing red and blue lights painted the night in chaotic colors. Officers had set up a perimeter, weapons drawn, whispering into radios. The store's glass door was shattered, and through it, they could see a terrified store clerk huddled behind the counter while 2 men waved pistols in the air. Nyah didn't wait for Dec to speak. "I want a negotiator on the line now. We go non-lethal unless we have no other option." Her voice carried authority, but Dec scoffed. "Non-lethal won't mean shit if they start executing people." He turned to the nearest officer. "Do we have a sniper in position?" Nyah's eyes snapped to him. "We're not doing this your way, Holloway." Dec stepped closer, his voice low but full of heat. "Then let's hope your way doesn't get that kid killed." The air outside the convenience store was electric with tension, thick and suffocating. The flashing police lights painted the scene in erratic bursts of red and blue, illuminating the panic written across every officer's face. Time was running out. Inside the store, the two armed suspects were unraveling, their movements sharper, their voices louder, their grip on control slipping by the second. Dec Holloway could feel it. The way these situations spiraled out of control. The way hesitation turned into disaster. He'd seen it before. He'd cleaned up the messes before. And yet here they were, standing still, waiting on the new chief's orders as if she had some magic solution that would change how these things worked. It pissed him off. Nyah stood beside him, gripping her radio tightly. "We need to establish communication now," she ordered, her voice cutting through the static. "Get me a direct line with them before this escalates." Dec clenched his jaw. "Before it escalates? Look inside, Calloway. It already has." His voice was low, but sharp. "We don't have time for this. Every second we waste is a second closer to that kid getting a bullet in his skull." His fingers twitched near his rifle. He knew how to end this. One clean shot. One less problem. Then it happened. The breaking point. One of the suspects, a twitchy, desperate-looking man in a ragged hoodie, suddenly grabbed the store clerk and yanked him forward. The boy, barely more than a teenager, stumbled, his eyes wide with terror as the suspect jammed the barrel of his pistol against the side of his head. "Back off or he dies." The man's scream was raw, cracking under the weight of his own panic. The officers tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. Dec moved without thinking, rifle raised, target locked. One shot. That's all it would take. The suspect's grip was unstable, his hands shaking. Dec had taken worse shots under worse conditions. He could end this right now. Then Nyah's voice sliced through the chaos like a blade. "Don't shoot." Dec froze for a fraction of a second, eyes snapping to her in disbelief. What the hell was she doing? Before he could argue, she was already stepping forward, hands raised, her entire posture shifting. Her movements were slow, deliberate, calculated. "Let me talk to him," she said, voice steady, unwavering. Dec's pulse pounded in his ears. She was making a choice, taking control in front of everyone. And if she was wrong, if she hesitated for even a second too long, that kid would die. The world around Nyah blurred. One wrong word, one wrong move, and the boy was dead. The suspect's grip on the clerk was tight, his hand shaking as he pressed the barrel of the gun harder against the kid's skull. Sweat dripped from his forehead. His breathing was erratic. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a man on the edge. Behind her, the weight of the department pressed down like a storm cloud. She could feel Dec's burning stare, his disapproval crawling up her spine. He thought she was making a mistake. Maybe she was. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let a kid die on her first week as chief. She took a slow step forward, keeping her hands in clear view. "What's your name?" Her voice was firm but not aggressive. She needed him to focus on her, not on the gun in his hand. The man's wild eyes flicked toward her. He swallowed hard, his jaw twitching. "Shut up. Stay back." His fingers tensed. Nyah could see it. The moment before a trigger gets pulled. She kept her voice steady. "I'm not here to trick you. I just want to know your name." The suspect hesitated. "Ricky." The name came out hoarse, uncertain, but it was something. A crack in the wall. Behind her, Dec shifted, his patience wearing thin. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. He's too far gone. Nyah ignored him. She wasn't talking to Dec. She was talking to Ricky. Ricky, listen to me. She took another step closer. I know you don't want to do this. I know you're scared. But killing him won't fix whatever's gone wrong in your life. Ricky's fingers twitched on the gun. The clerk whimpered. Nyah took another step. Let him go, Ricky. Give me the gun. The moment stretched. A razor-thin line between life and death. The air in front of the convenience store had turned suffocatingly still. Everything hinged on the next few seconds. Nyah could feel it in the way Ricky's fingers twitched against the trigger, in the way his chest rose and fell in sharp, erratic bursts. He was unraveling fast, and once that final thread snapped, there'd be no pulling him back. The store clerk whimpered, barely able to stand as Ricky yanked him tighter, his gun pressing into the boy's temple. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shadows over Ricky's wild eyes. Eyes that weren't seeing the room anymore, only the dark tunnel of his own panic. Behind her, the officers of Redwood Bluff PD were statues, frozen in place, waiting for something to tip the scale. Some wanted to believe she could talk him down. Others, Dec included, were just waiting for the inevitable. Nyah could feel Dec's presence like a blade at her back, his rifle locked, his breathing measured. He was watching, waiting for her to fail. He didn't trust her judgment. And if this went sideways, he'd never let her forget it. Nyah kept her voice level. "Ricky," she said, careful to keep her movements slow. "I know you don't want to do this. You think there's no way out, but that's not true." A pause. A flicker of hesitation in his grip. "You have a choice." Ricky's lips parted slightly, like he wanted to respond, but then, in the distance, a siren howled. The sound slammed into him like a physical force. His entire body jerked, his breathing turning frantic. He twisted his head, eyes darting toward the street, the walls closing in, escape routes vanishing. Nyah's stomach clenched as she saw the shift happen. He wasn't listening anymore. He was breaking. No. Ricky's voice cracked, raw and desperate. His hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the gun, and then, before Nyah could react, he yanked it upward. A single gunshot shattered the air. Nyah didn't move. She barely breathed. Her pulse hammered so hard it drowned out every other sound. Then, in front of her, Ricky collapsed. His body hit the tile floor, blood spreading like ink beneath him. The gun slipped from his fingers. His chest rose once, then stopped. Nyah already knew who had taken the shot. She turned, her eyes locking onto Dec. His rifle was still raised, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His stare burned through her, and she could hear the message loud and clear. "I told you." The air between them was thick, buzzing with something raw and electric. This wasn't just about a hostage. It was about power, about control, about who had the final say in this department. And in this moment, Dec had won. Then, without breaking eye contact, he lowered his rifle and walked away. The body had barely been taken away before the power struggle truly began. Inside Redwood Bluff PD, the silence was oppressive. Normally, the station was filled with noise, phones ringing, officers cracking jokes, paperwork being shuffled. But now, there was only the hushed murmur of conversations, just quiet enough for Nyah not to hear. Officers glanced at her, then quickly looked away. No one was outright challenging her, but no one was rallying behind her, either. She could feel the shift, the way the weight of authority had subtly begun tilting toward Declan Holloway. He wasn't the chief. He didn't have the title. But right now, he had something that mattered more. The department's trust. Her jaw clenched as she pushed open her office door, only to find Dec already there, leaning against her desk like he had been expecting her. Nyah closed the door behind her with slow, deliberate force. "You disobeyed a direct order." Dec exhaled, his expression unreadable. "I took the shot because it needed to be taken. If I had waited for you to figure that out, we'd be writing up a different kind of report right now." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "You didn't just take the shot. You undermined me. In front of my officers. In front of my department." Dec tilted his head slightly, his jaw tightening just a fraction. "Your department?" His voice was low, edged with something that made Nyah's spine go rigid. "You sure about that?" The words were a challenge, and they both knew it. She stepped forward, eyes locked onto his, refusing to back down. "You think this makes you the hero? You think it proves something?" Dec didn't move, didn't blink. "I think it proves that I did my job." Nyah let out a slow breath, keeping her expression even. "And I think it proves that you don't respect mine." The words landed like a bullet. The air between them was razor thin, stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Dec studied her for a long moment, then, slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself off her desk and stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the sharpness in his eyes. "I respect results." His voice was quiet, but heavy. "And results don't come from hesitation." Nyah's pulse pounded. He was trying to make this about her. About whether she was strong enough, fast enough, ruthless enough to lead. And the worst part? The department was watching, waiting, deciding. She had fought for everything she had. Every promotion, every ounce of authority, every damn step that had gotten her here. And she was not about to let a man like Declan Holloway take it away from her. He thought this fight was over. He was wrong. Nyah Calloway had spent her entire career fighting for control. Not just of her department, but of her place in it. She had fought against the assumptions, the quiet dismissals, the unspoken belief that she didn't belong. She had clawed her way to the top, taking every hit and pushing forward anyway. And now, in the middle of her own damn office, Declan Holloway stood in front of her, daring her to lose it all. The silence between them was sharp enough to cut. Neither of them moved, neither of them blinked. It wasn't about the shooting anymore. It wasn't even about Ricky. This was a battle for control. Nyah finally exhaled, stepping back, rolling her shoulders like she was settling in for a fight. "Let's get one thing straight, Holloway," she said, voice smooth as steel. "You think pulling that trigger made you the one in charge? It didn't. You think winning over the department with one shot means you run this place? You don't." She took another step closer, lowering her voice just enough to make sure he felt every single word. "You are an officer. I am your chief. And whether you like it or not, that isn't going to change." Dec didn't react. Not at first. Then, slowly, he let out a breath, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." Nyah's jaw clenched. "No, we won't." She moved to her desk, grabbed a folder, and flipped it open. Inside was a transfer request, one that had been sitting there for days, waiting for a signature. She picked up a pen, pressed it against the paper, and signed. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Effective immediately, you're being reassigned. New precinct. New jurisdiction. Congratulations." For the first time, Declan Holloway blinked. For the first time, he had no response. Nyah didn't wait for one. She closed the folder, straightened her shoulders, and walked past him, out of the office. And this time, every officer in the room stood up when she entered. Because she was in charge. And they finally knew it.